the subtitle of my book is How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley. And I don't like talking about Musk a lot, but he made visible the phenomenon that I have been researching and looking at for the past couple of years, which is the power grab by tech companies at the expense of democracy. And to some extent, Elon Musk makes it clear to everyone that this is about political influence, that this is about leveraging businesses and platforms towards political agendas, geopolitical agendas, that this is about the power of money in politics. But in many other ways, Musk is not unique. He's unique in being outspoken, in making visible that there is so much at stake. But I've highlighted a lot of the more invisible ecosystems of power and governance that private companies have pulled towards themselves, that democratic leaders have allowed them to grab. And I think it is time for a big shift. So what Europe does not need when it looks at investing in innovation and sort of, how to step up to this moment in time where there's talk about digital sovereignty, strategic autonomy, less reliance on the transatlantic relation as we've known it, is to repeat those steps and to outsource our digital lives to companies at all, and certainly not to foreign companies, and certainly not in ways where there is a lack of insight, understanding that we might gain about the technologies, where there's a lack of independent oversight, and ultimately a lack of agency on the part of democratically elected and accountable leaders, and impunity when there is injustice at the hands of these companies. I want to just take a couple of examples to illustrate what I mean. On the one hand, we can see how tech companies acquire de facto governance powers just by building a new technology that creates new capabilities and puts, for example, people's rights under pressure. I've spent a lot of time on spyware, more time than I ever thought I would need when I started addressing the issue in 2011, when encountering activists in the Middle East, from Iran, from Tunisia, from Egypt. And it may have seemed a tool of authoritarian regimes at the time, but as we've learned with the Pegasus project, investigative journalism project, European governments have used spyware to go after judges, opposition leaders, journalists, and civil society leaders. And this is typically a kind of technology that creates a de facto rights challenge outside of the grasp of governments, but also a technology where governments in democracies have not done enough to curb it, to ban it, to raise the moral high ground about how it is that we want to operate within the rule of law, protect people's rights, and so on. But I also think about the fact that it's now tech companies that are developing critical digital infrastructure, whether it's undersea cables, whether it's internet connectivity through satellites, infrastructure that is geopolitically crucial, but that is also under pressure, and where there are endless questions unanswered about who decides what access to data different actors have in this infrastructure, who should protect it, scan it for risk. What about the open space, a public space that the near Earth orbit is? But what about undersea cables that go outside of territorial waters? Who is supposed to protect? What happens in the case of an incident? And so on and so forth. Big, big consequences from developing this technological infrastructure that are really decided without much government intervention and with many legal questions unanswered still. And then, of course, how else could I address tech governance without mentioning artificial intelligence, which also creates entirely new realities. New realities because it discriminates systematically and is still put on the market. New realities because it's highly individualized, ever-changing, self-learning. And so when you put yourself in the shoes of a regulator, how is the regulator to know that one's rights are violated, whether a company operates to respect anything from antitrust to non-discrimination, or whether a person using these new and shiny services can even have the opportunity to know whether they've been treated fairly. So there's a de facto power coming from developing these technologies. And this is not just a matter of big and well-known tech companies, it's also smaller ones. It's really an ecosystem of companies that are engaged in grabbing more and more decision-making power without the accompanying oversight and set of rules really that are necessary in a rule of law-based system. I think also about the gap between kinetic or physical conflict when it's tanks that cross borders, as we saw in Ukraine when Russia invaded 2.5 years ago, and how differently that's treated from conflict in the digital realm, where for years prior to February 2022, there were attacks on civilian infrastructure. There were activities almost on a daily basis that now are part of the notion of hybrid conflict, but that were not really treated as such. If you ask your security services in any country that you may be living in, are we being attacked? They will say yes, every day. But at the kitchen table, people do not have the perception that we are under constant attack or even in a warlike situation. And that is because the international legal framework has not answered a lot of the questions of when is a cyber attack a breach of a nation's sovereignty? When does it reach the threshold of a war or armed conflict? And in that legal vacuum, there is a tendency also by democratic states to operate below the radar, to operate without being accountable. And so this is a concern with regard to what companies are doing, taking out botnets or other hostile actors across borders without a clear mandate, without clear oversight, with the discretion to share information about it at their own choosing, but also criticism of governments who are not incentivized to actually lift the bar and make sure that these rules are clarified. Now, the net effect is that governments have moved further and further away from sort of the epicenter of decision-making, not only because of the de facto power that these tech companies have, but also because of the greater dependence that governments now have around the world on tech companies for simply operating their daily affairs. Think about your tax authority, or think about local governments and all the software that they're using from everyday activities. And the problem is that in the process of creating more dependence of these tech companies, there is a loss of knowledge and insight on the part of governments themselves, obviously a lack of talent, but it means that the next wave of a digital innovation like AI will incentivize more outsourcing because the capacities within the governments have gone down. And so you end up in a negative downward spiral of a leaking of talent inside of governments, more and more outsourcing, more and more dependence, and more problems when that dependency is not clad in the proper oversight mechanisms. I also talk about power that is asserted not just through the de facto building of technologies or the dependency that governments have of them, but just the age-old lobbying that is just so much easier with the bank accounts that these companies have, not only by knocking on the doors of people here in Brussels and in other hubs of political power, but also by funding academia, think tanks, by developing civil society organizations. Let me just repeat that. Not just funding civil society organizations, but creating civil society organizations to roll out an agenda, to be able to be present in all these international fora where discussions about standards, about governance are held, where a lot of governments are just incapable to field people to all these different multilateral convenings. All in all, this leaking, loss, grab of governance power on the part of democratic governments hurts democracy, and I'm very worried about that. And I think it's really important also on the part of European lawmakers not to think, well, but we're a super regulator and we have the Digital Services Act, we have the Digital Markets Act, we have the AI Act, so we're in good shape. Unfortunately, no. These are steps in the right direction. Let's hope that they get enforced and operationalized the way in which they were dreamt up. But even with all these new laws in place, there is still enormous dependence, and there is still a lot of decision-making that is done by tech companies and not by European governments. I don't know how much time I have, otherwise I'll mention a couple more solutions, and then I'll wrap up. There is a lot that we can do, in part because so little has been done, so a lot of common sense steps can still be taken to rebalance the relationship between democratic institutions and leaders and tech companies when it comes to our digital lives. Solutions in the direction of creating much more transparency and public access to knowledge for academics, for journalists, for regulators, for parliamentarians themselves. More access to independent knowledge, for example, but also to make sure that governments, when using technology, are equally accountable in the domain that they've outsourced. One of the problems is that we see governments incentivized to sort of offload their own responsibilities by engaging companies. If police forces are not allowed to hack the phones of suspects in terror or crime cases, they can say, we don't do that. But if they are engaging a spyware company to do the same, then you can ask yourself whether they're actually not doing that. If there are rules about freedom of information for journalists to just hold to account the operations of government, then it shouldn't be a reference to a messaging service that only stores messages for one day and therefore the message is not being available to be an appropriate answer. So if there should be accountability of government operations and communications, it cannot be shielded behind tech companies and thereby sort of offloading this whole idea of transparency. But besides a focus on the operational role that governments play, I think they can use procurement much better. They should use investment much better. We talked about a little bit with my neighbor here already. And then, of course, there's regulation. But if we look at the EU specifically, which is not the focus of the tech coup necessarily, but because we're here as Friends of Europe, let me focus on Europe. Regulation is important, but I think in the current political climate, there will not be as ambitious a set of regulations adopted. So a focus on solid enforcement, a focus on leveraging the purchasing power of governments in Europe towards better outcomes, and earmarking investments towards more democratic governance, public values of technology are just a couple of directions that we must utilize better. Thank you very much.